Welcome to the Real Food Mental Health Podcast, where we explore the powerful connection between mental and physical health. My name is Cody Cox, a holistic nutritional psychotherapist, and I'm here to guide you on a journey to true wellness, mind, body, and spirit. If you're tired of quick fixes and want real solutions that address the root cause, you're in the right place. Let's get started on your path to lasting wellness. You're listening to Real Food Mental Health. My name is Cody Cox. And I've decided to do another solo today because I was at a conference for holistic health this past weekend, and I was actually on a discussion panel for practitioners who are a part of the local Weston A Price chapter here in Logan, Utah. The conference itself was pretty small. I think it was a good event though, and this panel session, it lasted about an hour. There were 5 of us answering all the questions. Because of that, we didn't actually get through all the questions, and there was a lot that I had to say, so I thought I would just go ahead and say that on my podcast. Now, if you're not familiar with the Weston A Price Foundation, I probably mention them a lot on this podcast and in my sessions with people. But Weston A Price was a dentist about 100 years ago. You can look him up and learn more about him, but the short version of the story basically is that even though he was a dentist, he became kind of a pioneer in modern holistic nutrition because he figured out that indigenous cultures had perfect dental health as well as physical health as a result of the food that they were eating and the lifestyles that they were living. So the Weston A Price Foundation, they've got local chapters, or you could call them like clubs or meetups. Kind of depends on where you are. Sometimes they don't exist and you have to start one, or they do exist. And if that's the case, typically there are regular meetings. In my case, we have potlucks every few months or so where we all bring food according to Weston A Price principles, which those principles, nutritionally speaking, are ancestral whole foods and properly prepared. So nutrient density and bioavailability are very important for Weston A Price philosophy type food. Now, some of the questions in this discussion panel, some of it's related to my personal life, some of it's related to my professional or clinical work. But let's just get into it here. So what first drew you personally to the Weston A Price principles? Well, it was my naturopathic doctor, actually, about 6 years ago. I was seeing her in southern Utah, and she could tell that I was passionate about nutrition. Now, interestingly, this doctor is very rooted in traditional Chinese medicine. She's a proponent of vegetarian diets, but for whatever reason, she decided to share the Weston A Price Foundation with me. So one day she said, you should check them out and maybe consider doing their health coaching training. Now, interestingly, they don't have a health coaching training, but I did find the foundation. They've got a lot of other great resources, even though they don't have an official Weston A Price training. And I've been listening to their podcast. I've been a supporter of the foundation ever since. Now, I mean, there is a much longer story to that, which I have shared in previous episodes. I've been into nutrition for about 20 years, actually. Yeah, about 20 years. It started with sports nutrition, and I think for most people, when you get into holistic nutrition, typically you get into it because you have a health problem or a loved one has a health problem that can't be fixed simply by covering up your symptoms with medication or surgery. And so you take it upon yourself to do your own research and figure out natural ways of taking care of that health problem, whatever it may be. So for me, 20 years ago, there wasn't really anything obvious for me at the time. So that's why I started with sports nutrition. Now, I was really into working out because I did notice that working out made me feel better. I had a clearer mind, I had more energy, and life was just generally happier. That maybe you could speculate and say that there was something there because I did notice a change in how I felt by engaging in healthier activities. Now, was my diet really that healthy? Not really. I was doing the best that I could back then with the limited information that I had. So I was very much a victim of modern marketing claims such as, like the low fat. I was going for the light products, low calorie, because for whatever reason, like you get this idea that when you see this kind of marketing, you just think that that's healthy. And that's also what they teach in schools. Now, I'm really hoping that changes in the near future because we have new U.S. dietary guidelines that just came out last week. In fact, my last podcast episode was about those guidelines and what my thoughts are on those. They are mostly good. I don't agree with all of them. But I do hope that people will start reinventing their idea of what they think is a healthy diet. Now, like I said, I was a victim of them, just your marketing claims on labels, things that I learned in health classes when I was in school. I ate low fat thinking that that would be better. Eventually, I found myself as a vegetarian for 2 years because when you hear that low fat is healthy, you gravitate toward a vegetarian or even a vegan diet thinking this must be optimal. But I'm not going to lie, in my personal experience being vegetarian for 2 years, I noticed that my health declined. And now, as a nutritionist, I understand why. It's because I wasn't eating healthy fat, I wasn't getting enough protein. There's probably a lot of other nutrients that I wasn't getting, but long story short, vegetarian was just not healthy for me. And that's really when I started noticing that I had health problems. And so I started getting more into the holistic nutrition. And fast forward to now, I am a functional nutritional therapy practitioner and also a licensed psychotherapist or mental health therapist. And so I practice both. I do them separately, I do them together. It kind of just depends on what people need. But that is essentially what really got me into nutrition and what led me to the Weston A Price Foundation. Now, the next question is, how did embracing these principles change the way you view health? Not just clinically, but in everyday life. So, interestingly, like as I got more into the holistic stuff, I got this idea that eating animal products might actually not be such a bad thing after all, especially the red meat and the saturated fat that typically comes from animal products, but not always. And so embracing these principles, some of them were hard to embrace, I'm not going to lie. So for example, the idea that maybe we're eating too much grains, and especially grains that are improperly prepared, which are causing a lot of health problems for most Americans, that was a hard thing for me to swallow, figuratively and literally. We really do overconsume our grains, and our grains are improperly prepared. They cause a lot of gut issues, which then creates and exacerbates chronic disease, including mental illness. So that was a difficult thing for me to think about, either getting away from the grains, reducing the grains, or learning how to properly prepare the grains. Now, if you're interested in properly preparing the grains, I'm not going to go too much into detail on this, but you do want organic whenever possible to avoid glyphosate and other pesticides and herbicides in your food, because grains are actually higher in pesticides and herbicides than any other food because they spray them multiple times before they even grind them into flour, and then they send the flour to the grocery store where you eventually buy them. So there's no way to wash it off. It soaks into the grain. It's more of a systemic problem, and ultimately it's a poison to the body, so you do not want to be putting that in your body. So organic whenever possible, but not only that, you want your grains to be whole and soaked, sprouted, or fermented as much as possible. Now, Once again, I'm not going to get into the details on that, so if you want to get more information on that, there's plenty of resources available as far as how to make sourdough bread, how to soak your grains, how to sprout your grains. There are a lot of different ways that you could do those things, and you could combine those as well. So like you could technically use soaked wheat and make sourdough bread, or you could use soaked wheat and make sourdough bread. It just depends on how much work you want to put into it. But doing that actually makes the nutrients more bioavailable and helps to neutralize the anti-nutrients like the phytic acid and other anti-nutrients that might be present in the grains. One of the questions here is, what's something that you do now that you never would have done earlier in your career? Well, that's recommending raw milk. That was another one that I had a hard time embracing, and lately I've been recommending raw milk more and more because I recognize that raw milk is superior in every way compared to homogenized and pasteurized milk. Now, why is that? Because even if you were to buy a homogenized, pasteurized whole milk from the grocery store, it's only like 3.25% fat. It's not even full fat. They take fat out of it. And so technically it's misleading for them to call it a whole milk because it's not actually in its whole form. So there's that. So you're getting a lot less cream, but then also the pasteurization process and the homogenization process denatures the milk. So essentially they're cooking it, they're processing it so that the fat is permanently emulsified with the milk part so that it doesn't separate when it sits too long. And that process basically destroys the nutrients and digestive enzymes in the milk, thus making it so that your body has a hard time digesting it, and you just end up getting very, very little nutritional value. That's from store-bought milk. From raw milk, you're getting a lot more fat. I'm not sure exactly what the percentage is. It probably just depends on the cow, honestly, and what the cow is eating. But from what I can tell, if I were to speculate, just looking at a jug of raw milk that's been sitting in my fridge for a few days, it looks like it's almost 50% fat, or maybe like 30 to 40% fat. Like I said, it probably depends on the cow and what they're eating, but it's a whole lot more fat than what you're getting from whole milk at the grocery store. And so I'm recommending that to people a lot more. I have heard in some instances where people have dairy issues and they start drinking raw milk and suddenly they can digest dairy just fine again. And I think it's because it's not pasteurized. So the enzyme lactase is an enzyme that helps you process lactose, which is the milk sugar, and that is still intact in raw milk. And so when you're drinking that, you're able to digest and absorb it a whole lot better. So that's something that I'm doing. Honestly, before I found the Weston A Price Foundation, I'm not sure there's much else that I'm recommending, just because most of the people I see are not really ready to get into the nitty gritty of nutrient dense ancestral whole foods. I start people out pretty light just because I'm trying to meet people where they are. Typically, where they are is they're coming from a standard American diet. Or if they're not coming from a standard American diet, maybe they've been trying to eat healthy, but they have the wrong idea of what healthy actually is, just because of all the propaganda and misinformation that's out there on nutrition and medical science in the last several decades. So I start out pretty light. Typically it's sleep and hydration, because those are universal things that everybody needs. And swapping out things that they're already eating for something that's a little bit more nutrient dense. And so I start with small steps. It's very rare that I get into fermented foods. As much as I love talking about those things, I just don't get to cover that very often. But I do think that those are also universally healthy for everyone if you can get to that point. It's just a matter of it's a little bit of a learning curve and maybe an acquired taste depending on the fermented food that you're consuming. So it can be hard to get used to. The Weston A Price Foundation emphasizes nutrient density and traditional food preparation. So I've already been talking about that. But the question is, how does this show up in your personal life or household? Well, it shows up a lot, actually. So if you were to look in my refrigerator right now, you probably would be a little bit confused if you're not coming from this understanding of homemade fermented foods that are nutrient dense. As of right now, off the top of my head, I've got a mason jar of water kefir. I've got a mason jar of milk kefir. I've got a jar of sourdough starter that's organic and from whole wheat as much as I can. And I also have a couple jugs of raw milk from a local farmer. Now, most people would look at that and be like, what is in your fridge? But, I mean, you would, at the very least, you would recognize the milk because it just looks and mostly tastes like normal milk. But the other things, I think people would be really confused. And so there's a lot of things that show up in my personal life as a result of the work of Dr. Weston A. Price. Now, the Weston A. Price Foundation, they have furthered his work, and they recommend more things than what he did 100 years ago. And that's how it should be. I mean, science is never complete. It's never settled. There's always new information coming out. So the foundation has worked really hard to come out with new information, new research, and therefore new recommendations that Weston A. Price didn't necessarily know about back then. What's something that you always try to have stocked at home? Well, that's hard to say. I mean, the main go-to for me is to have a good quality meats always in the freezer and the fridge, mostly in the freezer just because it keeps better in the freezer. But I make an effort to find pasture-raised, wild-caught meats, preferably grass-fed if they are grass-eating animals such as cows. But yeah, the highest quality meats possible. And the reason that that's so important is because if you don't get high quality meats, I feel like that's still a step up from your regular standard American diet, especially if you're coming from vegetarianism. It's still better to eat meat because you're going to get more nutrition that way than if you're just eating fruits and vegetables, or especially if you're eating grains all the time. But you want higher quality because the higher quality actually has more nutrients, more of bioavailability, so you absorb those nutrients better, and less toxins. Mammals store toxins in fat. So if a person or an animal is eating, say, like corn that's been treated with glyphosate or some other poison, that body will take that poison and store it in the fat. So yeah, sometimes it's caught in the liver and you expel it through your feces, but especially if you have a lot of fatty tissue, the body will try to push that out to the fat instead of absorbing it into the organs. And the body does that to protect you, because if it gets in the organs, it can cause all sorts of health issues. So anyway, the toxins are stored in the fat. And so if you're getting a low quality meat, most likely the fat that's in that meat is going to be unhealthy. And that's something that you want to avoid. Now, this is where I think the value is in the outdated advice when they say eat a low-fat diet. I think what they're referring to is actually really low-quality meat. When it comes to fatty red meat, maybe it is a good idea to have a lean cut of red meat if it's a cheap steak or a cheap ground beef. But if you can get a pasture-raised, grass-fed, grass-finished ground beef or a steak, you actually want more fat. So it really just depends on the quality that you're getting. So that is something that I always try to have stocked in my home, is a good quality meat. I also always have a good water filter. So currently I have a gravity filter similar to a Berkey. It is not a Berkey, but it's a different brand that basically is just as good. But Berkey's a very popular brand among the health conscious and homesteaders because you can get a fluoride filter. Now, in my state of Utah, as far as I know, the state of Utah is the first state in the country to ban the fluoridization of tap water, which that's a very recent thing in the last year or so. And I'm thrilled about that, except the fact that I might be moving out of state. But for everybody else who don't live in the state of Utah, you really have to filter out that fluoride if you live in a place that fluoridates the water. And so the Berkey water filter can filter that out if you have that extra attachment that filters out fluoride particularly. Now, the filter I have still does filter out fluoride if it were there, but just knowing that it filters fluoride probably means that it's pretty good, but it really just depends on where you are as to what kind of a filter you need to get. So your city might not fluoridate the water. And so maybe you should look at the city data. You can go to ewg.org to access some information, or directly to your city's website. Usually they publish that on a regular basis to tell you what's in the local tap water, so you know what kind of contaminants need to be filtered out of your tap water. The next question is, in your professional work, what is one Weston A Price principle that consistently makes the biggest difference for the people you serve? That's hard to say because, like I said, most people are coming from a very unhealthy diet and lifestyle. Typically, it's a standard American diet, which by definition is just what general Americans eat. And that is regular fast food, a whole lot of ultra-processed foods. So like maybe it's not from a fast food restaurant, but it's from a factory. It's ultra-processed. Like cereal, for example, is ultra-processed. Granola bars are ultra-processed. There are a lot of things that we think are healthy that are actually ultra-processed foods. But then there are other ultra-processed foods that I think we all would agree are unhealthy, such as candy and cookies and fried foods. But typically that's what's defined as the standard American diet. Most people are coming from that when they come to see me. Once in a while, I have people who have an idea of what whole foods are. They've been making an active attempt to eat a whole food diet, but they're just confused with what to do. So that's probably the main principle that makes the biggest difference, is simply eat whole foods. But that's only if people are compliant. So, I mean, compliant meaning I make a recommendation to focus on eating chicken at least once a day, because there are people who don't eat meat for several days at a time. It's not that they're vegetarian or they're against eating meat, but they just simply don't do it. And so I'll just say, I want you to eat a chicken breast every day. See how you feel. And so sometimes it does start that small, but as long as people are able to follow through with those recommendations, we can build on that and go toward more and more whole foods. People start feeling better, even if the whole foods aren't necessarily properly prepared. Just switching to whole foods can make a big difference. Next question, how do you see the connection between nourishment and the work you do, whether that's gut health, oral health, or mental and emotional well-being? To me, mental health is mostly biological. There are a lot of therapists, in fact, probably 90% of therapists or more, but don't really see the connection between mental health and nutrition or physical health. And a lot of it is just because of what we're taught. So the general public is not really taught that these things go hand in hand. We're taught to expect specialization and compartmentalization. Mental health is supposedly completely separate from everything else. At least that's the way our society structures it. And so because of that, therapists are also taught that kind of mindset, where we are taught that the mind is all about thoughts and relationships. It's purely psychosocial, and very little regard is given to the possibility that our physical health might contribute or cause mental illness. So to me, mental health and nutrition go hand in hand. I don't see any way to really separate that, because I've got so much training and personal experience, and I've helped my patients with this kind of stuff. To me, it's just not something that I can unlearn at this point. Like there's just no going back to only focusing on the mind and only talking about thoughts or relationships. There's a whole lot more to it than just that when it comes to mental health. The next question is, what are some signs you see in teeth, digestion, mood, or resilience when someone begins eating in a truly nourishing way? I think one of the first things is people start sleeping better, and if they're sleeping better, their mood improves. Another thing is they notice that they have more energy and more cognitive clarity, so they're able to think more clearly, they're able to recall information a lot better, and I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the sleep. So once again, if you're sleeping better, then you're just going to feel better anyway. But those are the first two things I see. Just better mood during the day and better sleep at night. The next question, Weston A Price principles. By the way, this is a side note, but the diet for the Weston A Price Foundation is called Wise Traditions, and their podcast is called Wise Traditions. So if you're wanting to look up more information, you can go to westonaprice.org, but Wise Traditions is that's the wording that you want to use when you're looking for certain resources. So with the Wise Traditions principles, they are often talked about in terms of food, but how do mindset, stress, and emotional nourishment fit into this framework? Actually, a lot. So even though I was kind of downplaying the psychosocial side of things, they do still play a role in a person's mental health. And even if you're not really addressing mental health directly, stress really plays a role in the nutritional side of things, in that if you are in a parasympathetic state, which essentially means like your quote unquote rest and digest state, so you're feeling calm, you're feeling at peace about life, you're actually going to digest your food more effectively and absorb nutrients better compared to when you're in a sympathetic state, which is the fight or flight state, always in a stressed out state, where you might still digest, the food is going to keep you alive, you're going to get calories, which I think is what most people are doing. They're eating in a sympathetic state and they're not digesting very well. So if you can work on reducing stress and emotionally nourish yourself through mindfulness practices such as just a mindfulness meditation, yoga, deep breathing, do what you can to calm the nervous system, that's actually going to be better for your physical health as well, because you'll be able to digest food better when you are eating those wholesome foods. The next question, in a modern world of convenience foods, busy schedules, and information overload, what do you find most challenging for families trying to nourish themselves well? Well, it's about convenience. It is very inconvenient to eat healthy food, or at least that's the major perception. Especially nowadays with the housing crisis that we're in, it kind of depends on the part of the country that you're in. If you're in the Midwest or the South, things are probably better for you compared to if you live in New England or pretty much the entire Western United States. The cost of living is pretty ridiculous in the last... it's hard to say, honestly. I started seeing prices go up in 2016, so about a decade ago. And I think most people have this perception that prices went up during the pandemic, but it was actually before the pandemic that we started seeing that. But because we're in a housing crisis, a lot of people are paying a really high amount for housing. And because they're worried about making their mortgage payment or their rent payment, they're very busy trying to work, trying to make money. And with their busyness, they think they don't really have time to prepare healthy foods. Um, this is especially true if they have children that they've got to drop off and pick up from school or take to soccer practice or whatever it might be. And so we are just so distracted with our modern society, whether that's because of financial reasons, or maybe we're just spending too much time on social media. So that's creating a perception that we don't have time. Most likely, we've got chronic disease that's contributing to a lack of motivation. In fact, I heard recently that 88% of Americans have at least one chronic disease. That's American adults, not all Americans, but American adults, it's 88% have at least one chronic disease that they're dealing with, whether they are aware of it or not. I mean, in my case, I've got conditions that haven't been formally diagnosed just because I don't see the point in diagnosis. I know what my symptoms are. I have an idea of what I'm doing as far as nutrition goes. And quite honestly, I know that if I saw a conventional medical doctor, all they would do is give me prescription medications, and that's just not the route that I want to go. So I don't see the point in getting a formal diagnosis for that reason. But the most challenging thing is really just convenience. And so I would encourage you to get over that convenience factor. So also in our modern world, we are taught that convenience is ideal in all cases, but that's actually false. The more convenient something is, most likely the less healthy it is for you. So, for example, if you just went to a fast food restaurant on your way home from work for dinner, and you just brought like a bunch of cheeseburgers to your family and you did that pretty regularly, yes, that is very convenient, but it costs you more money financially. So just right up front, that costs you more money, but then it also costs you more money in the long run because you end up with more health problems in the long run, which you then end up spending more money on trying to correct. And so cheap food actually comes at a cost. It might be cheap up front when you buy it, but remember, you are making a lot of compromises. Typically, you're not only paying for it with money, but you're paying for it with your health. So make sure you are prioritizing getting wholesome food. Do what you can to get over that convenience factor where I know life is busy sometimes, but most likely there's something in your day that's kind of sucking your time away. So maybe you're spending 2 or 3 hours a day scrolling through social media or checking your email or watching YouTube videos that you don't really need to do every day. So I'm not saying you have to cut those out, but maybe you could reduce them or put some restrictions on those, which would then allow you more time to cook a decent dinner for your family. Maybe you're not doing any of that stuff and you still don't really have time. And if that's the case, that's where I would say just choose a meat and choose a vegetable and call that dinner. It doesn't have to be a fancy recipe. It can be very simple. And that's still whole foods. It's still healthy. And I know to a lot of people that sounds boring, but the reason it sounds boring is because you're addicted to carbohydrates and ultra-processed foods. So, I mean, meat and vegetables, if that's what you've been eating consistently for a couple of weeks, chances are you're starting to feel better, and that sounds good to you at a certain point. So if that doesn't sound good to you right now, like I said, most likely it's because you're addicted to ultra-processed food and you need to just train your body to start craving healthy food again. Yes, it's inconvenient. It can be very difficult to get over that hurdle of getting away from the processed foods and going more for the whole foods, but trust me, it's worth it. Once you start feeling better, you're not going to want to feel the way that you felt on processed foods again. Now, the next question, this question was asked during the conference. Why is community such an important piece of nourishment? Well, I think community is so important. Unfortunately, we are living in a society that, for political reasons, we are hyper focusing on cultural diversity. And it's not necessarily that I think that's a bad thing. I do think that we should be, at the very least, tolerant of other cultures, if not welcoming of other cultures. That's a very good thing. But the problem I see with integrating cultures too much is that people are losing their sense of identity. They are losing their sense of belonging. They don't feel like they fit in anywhere, which is creating a sense of loneliness. Just everywhere I look, I think everybody or a lot of people feel a sense of loneliness because they don't feel like they fit in. Even within the same family, you might have different cultural values, nutritional values, religious values, political values that can make you feel isolated. And so community is very important, in my opinion, because it helps you feel that sense of belonging, that sense of purpose, and it helps you feel validated in those values where you might feel like you're the only one who believes in eating organic food, or you might feel like you're the only one who believes in God, or whatever it might be. But you do need to have that social support to encourage you to keep going. Another thing, nutritionally speaking, is if you feel like you have people supporting you in your nutritional values, maybe they don't necessarily agree with you, but they at least support you, you are going to be so much more successful compared to if you've got in-laws who just think you're a complete quack for believing in holistic health, and they are very, very conventional in their thinking, where they think everybody should just go get medication and surgery. If that's the case for you, it's going to be very difficult to follow through with your ketogenic diet or your GAPS diet or your whole food diet, whatever it might be, even though you believe in it. Now, some people are very strong and they don't care what other people think, and that's great, but you do still need to find your community or your tribe, at least somewhat as like a support group, because you never know when you're going to be struggling and you're going to need somebody to just kind of root you along. So coming up on the end of the list of questions that I have here, if somebody here today wanted to take just one step toward nourishing themselves or their family more deeply, what would you suggest they start with? Start where you are. I mean, it's really hard to say without actually talking to you and figuring out what your situation is, but I would suggest focusing on adding the good rather than removing the bad. The more good you add, the more the bad will just kind of naturally fall away. It'll be less appealing to you. So, for example, if you were coming from a standard American diet, focus on adding more whole foods. And if you're already eating whole foods, maybe consider switching to organic foods or pasture-raised, grass-fed, grass-finished meats, pasture-raised eggs. So just up the quality a little bit and see how that is for you. Typically, what I've found is as long as finances aren't too much of a strain, it's actually not that hard to just switch for slightly higher quality for foods that you're already buying anyway. It's just a matter of just recognizing that, yeah, organic food costs more, but it costs more for a reason. Like, nobody's really getting rich off of selling organic food. The reason it costs more is because farmers have to pay to have their farms certified. And from what I understand, it's actually quite costly to get that certification. And they have to make up for that cost by raising prices, unfortunately. It's not that it actually costs more to farm organically. It's more about the certification and the very strict federal regulations around calling your farm or your product organic. Same thing with pasture-raised, grass-fed. Kind of depends on which term we're talking about as to how strict and how loose these regulations are, but but most of them are regulated to some degree, and in many cases, the farmers have to get certifications that cost them money. So that's why healthy food costs more. But like I was saying when I was talking about raw milk, typically when you're paying for higher quality food, you're actually getting more for your money. It's not just that you're trading a conventional apple for an organic apple, and an apple is an apple. These are actually different apples in that they are different in nutritional content. So I did hear about a year ago that organic food is roughly 30% more nutritious than conventional food. And I mean, I can get into the science of that, but to keep it simple, that's just because the chemicals that they use in conventional farming actually leach out or prevent the development of the nutrients in that food. So you do want to avoid those poisons as much as possible, because you'll get more nutrient quality that way, as well as more bioavailability. So that's the first thing I would say start with. So I mean, you're just taking small steps, whether that's recognizing that maybe you're not drinking enough water, so you start drinking more water. Maybe you're not eating enough vegetables, so you start eating more vegetables. And it's like I said, maybe if you are eating whole foods and it's time for you to start switching to higher quality whole foods, maybe that's it. So it really just depends on where you are starting, but start out small and just slowly work your way up over time. It might take you months or years or maybe even decades to really be eating a very wholesome diet, but we all have to start somewhere. Even I started in a position where I used to make fun of people who believed in holistic health until I learned what holistic health actually was, and now there's no unlearning it, because to me it's so much more wholesome, it's so much more sustainable, and in my opinion, it's actually cheaper, even though like the price tag on organic food appears to cost more. In the long run, you end up with better health, a better quality of life, better relationships, and just everything is better overall. So to me, it's worth making sure that you get higher quality food. Now, that's pretty much it for the panel discussion. Now, this recording isn't quite an hour, but it took an hour because there were 5 of us responding to these questions. We didn't even get to most of the questions, honestly. One of the questions at the end too was, how can people get involved locally? Well, if you're interested in the Weston A Price Foundation, chances are there's a Weston A Price chapter in your local area. If there's not, you can start one. You don't have to be a practitioner to start a local Weston A Price chapter. But that's a really good way to develop a sense of community. So maybe you are living in a city that doesn't seem very holistically minded. You're feeling a little bit isolated. Connecting with other Weston A Price minded people can actually be a way to develop develop friendships, but also you can network. If you are a practitioner, you can potentially work out building a new business with somebody else who's like-minded. There's a lot of opportunity with connecting with your local Weston A Price chapter. I'm not sure exactly off the top of my head what the website is to go to find that, but I do know if you go to westonaprice.org, you can there's a button somewhere to find your local chapter. Like I said, there might not be a local chapter in your area, and if there's not, you can start one. The only criteria, as far as I know, are that you basically have to keep a running list of local resources. So this would be resources for finding raw milk, resources for finding pasture-raised meats, and just high-quality foods in general. And if somebody were to contact you as the chapter leader, you would be able to provide that list to them. So, I mean, that's mostly all you're supposed to do as a chapter leader. Regular meetings are very nice to have, especially for members of the group who want to network, build a sense of community. And so My understanding is typically that happens like once a quarter, maybe a couple times a year. It kind of just depends on where you are. There's also, it's pretty common to start Facebook groups so that you've got like an online community within your local chapter. I'm not really on Facebook, so I can't really speak to that, but I know that is a thing. So if you're interested, go to westinaprice.org. You should be able to click around and find your way from there. If you've got questions for me, please feel free to leave comments on Spotify, send me an email. It should be pretty self-explanatory. Whatever platform you're listening to my podcast on, you should be able to find links to my website, my clinical website, or also my podcast website. You can send me messages through either of those. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. I keep inviting people to, like, if you want to send me a voice message, I'd be happy to showcase that on my podcast. But so far, nobody has done that. So please, if you want to send me a message, feel free to do so, and I'll consider adding that to the show.
Real Food Mental Health is intended for informational and entertainment purposes only. Cody Cox does not necessarily endorse all of the content shared by guests. The information presented on this podcast is not intended to replace medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. While Cody is a healthcare provider, he is not your provider. Always seek the advice of an appropriate healthcare practitioner with any personal questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Do not disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast. Reliance on information provided by this podcast is at your own risk. Thank you for listening.